It was late autumn when I decided to visit my uncle's old cabin deep in the woods. The place had been abandoned for years, but he had left it to me in his will. I was 34 at the time, single, and living in a small apartment in the city. The idea of getting away from the noise and stress sounded like a dream. The cabin wasn't in the best shape, but I thought it would be a good weekend project to check it out and see what needed fixing. The cabin was about 3 hours from the city, surrounded by thick forest and tucked away from any main roads. I packed light, just some basic tools, food, water, and a sleeping bag. I left early on a Friday morning to get there by noon. The drive was uneventful, the last stretch being a gravel road that seemed to go on forever. Finally, the cabin came into view. It sat in a small clearing, the wood dark and weathered from years of neglect. The windows were intact, but the porch sagged slightly. There was an overgrown path leading to the front door and a rusted metal shed a few yards to the side. Despite its condition, the place had a certain charm, like it was waiting to be brought back to life. The air was crisp, the forest around me silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I grabbed my bag and headed to the porch. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, and I noticed claw marks on the door, probably from a raccoon or a bear. The door wasn't locked, so I pushed it open and stepped inside. The inside smelled of damp wood and mildew. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners. There was a small kitchen area to the left, a living space with a stone fireplace, and a single bedroom to the right. Everything was exactly as my uncle had left it, down to the old magazines on the coffee table. I spent the first few hours cleaning. I swept the floor, aired out the cabin, and started a fire in the fireplace to chase away the chill. By late afternoon, I had made decent progress and decided to explore the area. There was a small creek about a quarter mile from the cabin. The water was clear, and the sound of it flowing was calming. I walked along its edge, noticing animal tracks in the soft mud, deer, rabbits, and something larger that I couldn't identify. It was peaceful out there, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the only person in the world. As the sun began to set, I made my way back to the cabin. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. I tried to ignore the unease that crept over me. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. That night, I cooked a simple meal on the old gas stove and ate by the fire. The warmth and light made the cabin feel cozy, almost like it wasn't abandoned. I unrolled my sleeping bag in the bedroom and settled in for the night. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The fire had died down, leaving the cabin in near total darkness. The only sound was the occasional crackle of cooling wood in the fireplace. Then I heard it, a faint noise outside, like someone walking on the gravel path. I froze, listening. Could have been an animal, but it didn't sound like one. The steps were slow and deliberate, crunching the gravel in an almost rhythmic pattern. They stopped just outside the cabin. My heart was pounding. I reached for the flashlight I had left by my side and turned it on, casting the beam toward the window. I couldn't see anything. The steps started again, this time moving around the side of the cabin. I got up slowly, trying not to make any noise. My uncle had left an old hunting rifle in the cabin, and I had seen it leaning against the fireplace earlier. I grabbed it, though I wasn't sure if it was even loaded. I moved to the living room and stood near the front door, listening. The footsteps stopped again. It was silent for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then there was a knock, soft but deliberate. It was just 3 knocks and then nothing. I didn't move. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe it was a lost hiker or a local, but why would they be out here in the middle of the night? I didn't call out or open the door. I just stood there, rifle in hand, waiting. After a while, I heard the steps retreating, moving back down the gravel path toward the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, The next morning, I stepped outside to look for any signs of what had happened. The gravel path had fresh footprints, bare human footprints. They led from the woods to the cabin and then back again. I decided to leave. Whatever charm the cabin had was gone. I packed my things quickly and loaded them into the car. As I turned to take one last look, I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden behind a tree. She was tall and thin, her hair long and matted. She wore a dirty dress, and her skin looked pale, almost gray. She didn't move, didn't wave or call out. She just stood there watching me. I didn't wait. I got in the car and drove as fast as I could down that gravel road, not stopping until I reached the main highway. I don't know who she was or what she wanted, but I haven't been back to that cabin since. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those bare footprints and the way she just stood there, silent and still. It's not the kind of thing you can forget. It was the summer of 2015, and I had just finalized my divorce from my husband, Darren. We were married for 10 years before things fell apart. To make matters worse, Darren had grown close to my sister, Melanie, during our separation. It wasn't romantic or anything, but the bond they shared felt like a betrayal to me. Darren had always been fond of his grandmother, Helen too, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had raised him when his parents passed away. I could never quite tell if she liked me, but she tolerated me well enough. After the divorce, Melanie suggested we all spend some time at Helen's cabin in northern Maine. It was a small, rustic place she rarely used anymore, sitting deep in the woods by a lake. I didn't want to go, but Melanie insisted it would help reset things between us. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Helen didn't seem thrilled about hosting me, but she smiled and said we'd enjoy ourselves. The cabin wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting area. The walls were lined with old photos, worn furniture, and shelves full of books and knickknacks. It smelled faintly of damp wood and mothballs, but it felt solid, like it had been standing for decades and would outlast us all. The first few days were uneventful. Darren mostly kept to himself, fishing by the lake or walking in the woods. Melanie and Helen spent their time cooking or playing cards, leaving me to read or wander around the property. I tried to enjoy the quiet, but something about the cabin felt off. At night, the forest came alive with strange noises, twigs snapping, distant rustling, and occasional howls that sent shivers down my spine. Helen said it was just wildlife, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't entirely alone out there. One afternoon, Darren suggested we hike to an old fire tower a few miles away. It sounded like a good distraction, so we packed some water and snacks and set off. The trail was overgrown and narrow, winding through dense trees and rocky terrain. The air was humid and heavy, and mosquitoes swarmed around us in clouds. After an hour or so, we reached the tower. It was tall and rusted, with a shaky ladder leading to a small platform at the top. Melanie and Darren climbed up while I stayed below, uneasy about the creaking structure. Helen sat on a nearby rock, catching her breath. From above, Darren called down that he could see for miles. Just trees and more trees stretching endlessly in every direction. I envied his excitement but couldn't shake my discomfort. The forest seemed too still, too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. On the way back, Helen stumbled and twisted her ankle. She insisted she was fine, but it slowed us down considerably. Darren offered to carry her, but she waved him off, determined to manage on her own. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun was setting, and the woods were already cloaked in shadows. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the creaks and groans of the cabin as the wind pushed against it. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my window, slow, deliberate steps moving through the gravel path. I sat up, heart pounding, and peered through the curtains. There was no one there, just the faint outline of trees swaying in the dark. I told myself it was probably Darren or Melanie, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The next morning, I found Darren and Helen arguing quietly in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but their expressions were tense. When they noticed me, they stopped abruptly, pretending nothing had happened. The day dragged on uneventfully until Melanie suggested we go for a swim in the lake. The water was cold and murky, and I hesitated before wading in. Darren stayed on the shore, watching us with a distant expression. As I swam, I felt something brush against my leg. Startled, I froze, scanning the water for signs of movement. Melanie laughed, saying it was probably just a fish, but I wasn't so sure. The lake was deep and dark, and I couldn't shake the image of something lurking beneath the surface. That evening, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Helen seemed anxious, her usual sharp demeanor replaced by unease. Darren barely spoke, and Melanie tried unsuccessfully to lighten the mood. After dinner, I went outside for some air. The night was cold and clear, the stars bright against the black sky. As I stood on the porch, I heard faint whispers coming from the woods. They were too quiet to make out, but they sent chills down my spine. I turned to go back inside, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. Panicking, I knocked and called for someone to let me in, but no one answered. The whispers grew louder, closer, until they seemed to surround me. Finally, the door creaked open, and Melanie stood there, looking confused. She said she hadn't locked the door and hadn't heard me knocking. I wanted to believe her, but something about her expression didn't sit right. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, every shadow seemed amplified, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I told Melanie I was leaving, but she insisted I stay. Helen backed her up, saying it would be rude to leave so abruptly. Darren didn't say anything, just watched me with that same distant expression. Reluctantly, I stayed, but the unease only grew. The whispers returned that night, louder and more insistent. I tried to wake Melanie, but she wouldn't budge, as if she were in some deep, unnatural sleep. Desperate, I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, determined to confront whatever was out there. The whispers seemed to retreat as I approached the edge of the woods, drawing me deeper into the trees. I don't know how far I walked or how long I was out there, but eventually I found myself in a small clearing. In the center was a pile of stones, arranged in a crude circle. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. Before I could investigate further, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness, but there was no one there. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I ran back to the cabin, heart racing, and locked the door behind me. No one else seemed to notice or care about what had happened, and I realized I was on my own. The next day, I packed my things and left without saying goodbye. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Darren and Helen standing on the porch, watching me go. There was something in their eyes that sent a chill down my spine, a knowing, almost smug look, as if they'd been expecting this all along. I never went back to that cabin, and I cut off contact with Melanie soon after. To this day, I don't know what was out there in those woods, but I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't entirely human. Whatever it was, it felt ancient and malevolent, like it had been waiting for someone to stumble upon it. And I'll never forget the way Darren and Helen looked at me as I drove away, like they knew I'd narrowly escaped something far worse. It was 2 a.m., and the rain hadn't let up since my shift started. I was stationed at an isolated border checkpoint deep in the forest, somewhere along the northern edge of Montana. The year was 2019 and I was 28 years old. A few years into this job, though nights like these still made me question why I had taken it in the first place. It wasn't exactly the kind of work I dreamed of, but it paid well enough and most nights were quiet. Too quiet. The cabin where I worked was small and bare bones. Nothing more than a single-room structure with a desk, a few chairs, and an ancient radio that barely worked. There was a heater in the corner, but it was temperamental, flickering off every hour or so. Outside, there were 2 floodlights attached to the roof, casting just enough light to illuminate the road leading up to the checkpoint. Beyond that, the forest swallowed everything. The rain drummed relentlessly against the roof, a constant, hollow sound that seemed to grow louder the longer I sat there. I stared at the monitors in front of me, which displayed grainy, black and white feeds from the security cameras outside. The main road was empty, as it had been all night. Occasionally, I'd see a flash of movement, a branch swaying in the wind or a raccoon scurrying across the pavement, but nothing else. I checked the logbook again. The last vehicle to pass through had been a delivery truck at 8:15 p.m. The driver had been a middle-aged guy with a thick beard and a tired expression. He'd handed over his paperwork without a word, waited for me to wave him through, and then disappeared into the night. Since then, it had been just me, the rain, and the endless hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. At some point, I got up to stretch my legs. The cabin wasn't big enough to pace in, so I stepped outside under the awning. The cold hit me immediately, a damp, bone-chilling cold that seeped through my jacket and into my skin. I stood there for a moment, staring out at the dark forest beyond the road. The rain blurred everything, turning the trees into shadowy shapes that seemed to shift and sway. I didn't like being outside for too long. The forest always felt too close, the trees too tall and oppressive. It was easy to imagine something watching from the darkness, even though I knew it was just my mind playing tricks. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive in a way that it shouldn't be, like it was holding its breath, waiting. I was about to head back inside when I noticed something on the road. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the rain, but as I squinted, I realized it was a figure, a person, walking slowly toward the checkpoint. My stomach tightened. We didn't get many pedestrians out here, especially not in the middle of the night during a storm. Most people stuck to their cars, and those who didn't usually had a reason, none of them good. The figure came closer, and I could make out more details. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat that clung to his body from the rain. He wasn't running or stumbling, just walking steadily, as if the weather didn't bother him at all. When he was about 30 feet away, I stepped back inside and locked the door. I didn't want to deal with anyone tonight, especially someone who had no business being out here. The man reached the checkpoint and stopped. He stood just outside the floodlights range, so I could only see his outline on the monitors. He didn't approach the window or try to get my attention. He just stood there, motionless. I watched him for a while, unsure of what to do. My training hadn't exactly covered situations like this. Was I supposed to call for backup? Confront him? The man wasn't doing anything illegal as far as I could tell, but something about him felt off. Minutes passed and he didn't move. I felt a growing unease, the kind that starts in your gut and spreads like cold water through your veins. I told myself he was probably just lost or waiting for a ride, but that didn't explain why he was standing so still, or why he hadn't reacted to the rain. Finally, I decided to check the monitors more closely. I switched to a different camera angle, one that showed the man from the side. What I saw made my skin crawl. He wasn't just standing still. He was facing the cabin, his head tilted slightly upward, like he was staring directly at me through the wall. I couldn't see his face clearly. His hood cast a shadow over it, but there was something unnatural about the way he was positioned, like his body was rigid, almost too rigid. I felt an overwhelming urge to turn off the lights and lock myself in the storage closet. but I forced myself to stay calm. This was probably just some weirdo looking to mess with me. If I ignored him long enough, he'd leave. Except he didn't. Hours seemed to pass as I sat there, watching the monitors. The man didn't move once. The rain kept falling, the forest kept swaying, and he just stood there, staring. I tried to distract myself by filling out paperwork and checking the logbook again, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes, I glanced back at the screen, half expecting him to be gone. But he was always there. At some point, the power flickered. The lights dimmed for a moment, and the monitors went black before everything came back online. My heart jumped into my throat, and I immediately checked the cameras. The man was gone. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. He couldn't have disappeared that quickly, not without me seeing him move. I switched through all the camera angles, but the road was empty. And then I heard it, a sound from outside, a soft, deliberate knock on the cabin door. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The knock came again, louder this time. I wanted to believe it was just the rain playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Slowly, I reached for the radio on the desk and tried to call for backup. Static filled the airwaves, the signal drowned out by the storm. I cursed under my breath, my hands trembling as I set the radio down. The knock came a third time, followed by a low scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and then the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the floodlights outside. I could hear the rain more clearly now, along with something else. A soft shuffling sound, like footsteps circling the cabin. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles turned white. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. And then, from behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of the storage closet door creaking open. I decided to spend the winter break in a secluded cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was 2021, and I had been burned out from work and life in general. The idea of unplugging from everything seemed perfect, and the cabin belonged to a friend of a friend. It was old but sturdy, and best of all, it was far enough from civilization that I wouldn't have to worry about anything but myself and my dog. Max was a 4-year-old German Shepherd and my best companion. He was well-trained, fiercely loyal, and always alert. I thought having him with me would make the trip feel safer, though I didn't expect to need that safety. This was supposed to be about peace and quiet. I loaded up my truck with enough supplies for 2 weeks: food, water, firewood, extra blankets, and a rifle I rarely used but brought just in case. Max hopped into the passenger seat, and we set off. The cabin was about 2 hours from the nearest town. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon, and the temperature had already dropped below freezing. The place looked exactly as described. A small, weathered structure surrounded by towering pines, with a woodpile stacked against one side and a narrow creek running nearby. The isolation was immediate and almost suffocating. There was no cell service, and the only road leading to the cabin was little more than a dirt path. I unpacked quickly, wanting to get settled before nightfall. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dampness, but it was clean and had everything I needed: a wood stove, a small kitchen, a single bed, and a sturdy door with a heavy bolt. I set up Max's bed in the corner and made a mental note to lock the door every night. I didn't expect any visitors, but old habits die hard. The first couple of days were uneventful. I spent my time reading, chopping firewood, and taking Max on short hikes around the area. The forest was dense and silent except for the occasional rustle of animals. Max seemed to enjoy the freedom, bounding through the snow and sniffing everything in sight. At night, the only sounds were the crackling of the wood stove and the wind howling outside. It was peaceful, but there was a strange heaviness to the quiet, as if the woods were holding their breath. On the fourth night, things started to feel off. Max was restless, pacing back and forth near the door. He would sit for a while, then suddenly stand and stare at the window as if he'd heard something I couldn't. I tried to calm him down, thinking he was just adjusting to the new environment, but his behavior made me uneasy. I double-checked the bolt on the door and kept the rifle within reach before going to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to Max growling softly. My heart immediately started pounding. The room was pitch black except for the faint glow of the dying fire. I sat up slowly, trying to listen for whatever had disturbed him. At first, there was nothing but the wind, but then I heard it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on snow. I froze, every sense on high alert. The sound came again, closer this time. Max stood by the door, his body tense and his ears pinned back. I grabbed the rifle, my hands trembling as I loaded it. My first thought was that it might be a deer or some other animal, but the pattern of the steps was too deliberate. Someone was out there. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my back against the wall and the rifle across my lap. Max didn't leave the door, and the footsteps eventually faded into silence. When morning came, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. I told myself it was probably a hunter passing through or some lost hiker, though I knew how unlikely that was given the remoteness of the cabin. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin more thoroughly, hoping to find some explanation for the night before. Max and I followed the creek for about a mile, keeping an eye out for tracks. The snow was mostly undisturbed except for the faint traces of deer and rabbits. But just as I was about to turn back, I saw them, boot prints, partially covered by fresh snow but unmistakably human. They led from the direction of the woods toward the cabin. A cold wave of dread washed over me. Whoever had been outside last night hadn't just been passing through. They had been coming toward the cabin. I followed the tracks as far as I could, but they disappeared into the trees. Max stayed close to my side, his ears perked and his nose working overtime. That night, I made sure the wood stove was fully stocked and kept every light in the cabin on. Max seemed calmer, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, circling the cabin this time. They were slow and deliberate, pausing near the windows and the door. Max barked loudly, a deep, threatening sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. I shouted through the door, hoping to scare them off, but the footsteps continued as if mocking me. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn finally came, I stepped outside with the rifle and Max by my side. The snow was trampled all around the cabin, the boot prints clearly visible. They led back into the woods but disappeared after a few yards, as if the person had intentionally avoided leaving a trail. My nerves were shot and I seriously considered packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to be driven away by fear. I told myself I would stay one more night. That evening, I built a fire outside the cabin, hoping the light and smoke would deter whoever was out there. Max stayed close, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness. I sat by the fire with the rifle across my lap, trying to convince myself that it would be okay. But deep down, I knew I had made a mistake staying. Around 2 a.m., Max started barking furiously. I grabbed the rifle and stepped outside, my breath visible in the freezing air. The fire had burned low, casting eerie shadows across the snow. I scanned the tree line, but everything seemed still. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. 2 sets of boot prints leading toward the cabin, and 1 set leading away. Whoever had been watching me wasn't alone. I didn't wait to see if they would come back. I grabbed Max, loaded the truck, and drove away, leaving most of my supplies behind. As I sped down the narrow road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. The snow-covered forest was silent, but the sense of being watched never left me. When I finally reached the nearest town, I reported what had happened to the local authorities. They said they'd look into it, but didn't seem too concerned. To them, it was just another strange story from the woods. But to me, it was a reminder that sometimes the things you can't see are far more dangerous than the ones you can. I never went back to that cabin. It had been 2 years since my sister passed away, leaving behind her cabin in the mountains. It was an isolated place, nestled deep in a dense forest, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. She had loved that cabin, often retreating there to escape the stress of city life. I never visited often when she was alive, thinking it was too remote, too lonely. But now it felt like the right place to go, to feel closer to her and sort through her belongings. It was a chilly October morning when I packed up my truck and made the drive out there. The air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves, and the sunlight barely filtered through the dense canopy of trees lining the narrow road. The cabin was just as I remembered it, a modest wooden structure with a wraparound porch, weathered but sturdy. It stood in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to block out the world. I stepped inside, and the air was heavy with the scent of wood and a faint trace of lavender, her favorite. The interior was simple, with a living room, a small kitchen, and a bedroom. The furniture was old but well kept, and her personal touches were everywhere. Books stacked haphazardly on the shelves, a throw blanket draped over the couch, and photos on the mantel. It was as if she had just stepped out and would be back any moment. I spent the first day cleaning and organizing. The cabin hadn't been used since her death, and a thin layer of dust coated everything. I went through her belongings, deciding what to keep and what to donate. It was an emotional process, but it felt good to be surrounded by her things, to remember her in this space she loved so much. That evening, I made a simple dinner and ate on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. The forest grew darker and quieter, the only sounds the occasional rustle of leaves and the chirping of crickets. I felt a strange mix of peace and unease. It was so silent, so still, that I was hyper-aware of every noise. But I told myself it was just my nerves and the unfamiliarity of being alone in such a remote place. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easily. The mattress was too firm, the air too cold, and my mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept thinking about her, about how much she had loved this place, and how different it felt to me. Eventually, I drifted off, only to be jolted awake in the middle of the night. There was a sound outside, a crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, straining to hear more. The sound came again, closer this time. I reached for my phone, but there was no service. Of course, there wasn't. This far out, I should have expected that. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else. The footsteps sounded deliberate, heavy. I stayed still, my heart pounding in my chest, until the sound faded into the distance. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was being paranoid. The forest was full of wildlife, and it wasn't unusual to hear noises at night. But as I stepped outside to gather firewood, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the dirt path leading to the porch. They were too big to be mine and too defined to belong to an animal. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone had passed through the area, a hiker or a hunter. But why would they come so close to the cabin? And why hadn't they knocked or made their presence known? I spent the rest of the day trying to stay busy, but I couldn't shake the unease. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something watching me from the trees. By the time the sun set, I was on edge, every nerve in my body alert. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking them before going to bed. I kept a flashlight and a kitchen knife by my bedside, just in case. I didn't sleep much, every sound making me jump. At some point in the early morning, I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps outside. This time, they didn't fade away. They stopped right outside the bedroom window. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. The footsteps resumed, moving around the cabin, slow and deliberate. I wanted to look, to see who or what was out there, but fear kept me frozen. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds stopped, and the silence was deafening. When dawn finally broke, I mustered the courage to go outside. The footprints were back, circling the cabin this time. I followed them into the woods, my heart pounding with every step. They led me to a clearing not far from the cabin. In the center was a crude campsite, a fire pit surrounded by rocks, a torn sleeping bag, and empty cans scattered around. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing through. They had been staying nearby, watching me. I hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I packed up my things, deciding to leave as soon as possible. But as I loaded my truck, I noticed something else. Deep scratches on the back of the cabin, as if someone had been trying to get inside. I didn't wait to find out who it was or what they wanted. I drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. As the cabin disappeared in my rearview mirror, I felt a mix of relief and regret. I wanted to feel closer to my sister, to honor her memory, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, didn't want me there. It wasn't until I was back home, safe in my own bed, that the full weight of what happened hit me. I tried to convince myself it was just a drifter, someone looking for shelter. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Whoever had been out there had been watching me, waiting. And the scratches on the cabin weren't from someone trying to get in. They were from someone trying to scare me away. I never went back to the cabin. Every time I think about it, I feel a chill run down my spine. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know I was lucky to leave when I did. It was late October and I had just turned 29. After months of feeling stuck in the monotony of my city life, I decided I needed a break. Somewhere remote, quiet, somewhere I could breathe again. The internet led me to a small cabin rental deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It was perfect, a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, surrounded by dense woods and completely off-grid. The website promised peace and solitude, and I was sold. I arrived in the early afternoon. The gravel road leading to the cabin twisted and turned through miles of forest. My car bumped and jolted on the uneven path, but when the cabin finally came into view, it was worth it. A small, weathered structure with a porch and a single rocking chair. Behind it, the forest stretched endlessly. The air was crisp, with that earthy scent of fallen leaves. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a kitchenette, a small table, a couch, and a wood-burning stove. There was a door leading to the bedroom and another to the bathroom. The place had a rustic charm, the kind of place where time felt slower. By the time I got the fire going in the stove, the sun was starting to set. The woods grew darker, and the silence became heavy. No hum of traffic, no distant chatter, just the occasional creak of the trees in the wind. It was unsettling at first, but I reminded myself that this was what I wanted. An escape. That first night, I barely slept. Every sound outside felt magnified. A branch snapping, leaves rustling. It all set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was just the forest's natural rhythm. Still, I kept the flashlight within reach just in case. The next day, I decided to explore the area. There was a hiking trail behind the cabin that supposedly led to a small lake. I grabbed my backpack and set out. The trail was narrow, barely more than a path worn down by time. The trees loomed high overhead, their bare branches clawing at the sky. About an hour in, I found the lake. It was beautiful, surrounded by tall pines and still as glass. I sat on a fallen log, listening to the water lap gently at the shore. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. But then I noticed something. Across the lake, on the far shore, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was a tree stump or a shadow, but it moved. It was a person, standing still, facing my direction. I couldn't make out any details from that distance, but the sight unnerved me. I waved, more out of habit than friendliness, but the figure didn't respond. I decided it was time to head back. As I retraced my steps, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt different now, heavier. The air seemed colder, and every sound felt sharper. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door. I told myself it was just someone else out for a hike, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, the noises outside were worse. Footsteps, faint but deliberate, circled the cabin. I sat in the dark, heart pounding, clutching a hunting knife I'd found in one of the kitchen drawers. The footsteps would stop, then start again, always just out of sync with my breathing. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first light broke through the trees, I went outside to check. There were no footprints in the dirt around the cabin, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, that my nerves were playing tricks on me. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to cut my trip short and leave the next morning. That evening, as I packed my things, I noticed something odd. One of my hiking boots was missing. I searched the cabin, top to bottom, but it was nowhere to be found. The thought of it being outside, out there in the dark, made my stomach churn. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, knife in hand, waiting for the sun to rise. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of the porch creaking. Slowly, I got up and moved toward the window. The first rays of light were filtering through the trees, but the porch was still in shadow. I squinted, trying to make out what had caused the noise. That's when I saw it. My missing boot, placed neatly in the middle of the porch. I didn't think. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the car. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the gravel road, not caring about the bumps or the scratches from the overhanging branches. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, my chest tight. I looked back, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the forest, watching me. There was nothing. I never found out who or what had been out there. I didn't go back to the cabin, didn't even contact the owner to explain why I'd left early. For weeks, I had nightmares about the figure by the lake, about the footsteps circling the cabin. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever it was, they let me leave. I was looking for a break. Life in the city had been wearing me down, and I wanted some time to myself. My friend had mentioned a small cabin his family owned, tucked away in a remote area near an old graveyard. He joked that the place was creepy, but it sounded like exactly what I needed. Peace, quiet, and isolation. I packed lightly, just enough clothes for a week, some canned food, a few basic tools, and a book. The cabin was a 3-hour drive away, and the last stretch of the journey took me down a dirt road that twisted and turned through dense woods. I hadn't seen another car for at least 30 minutes, and my phone signal had vanished long before that. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was starting to set. The place was small, just a single room with a loft for sleeping. It looked weathered, with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but it was sturdy enough. Behind it was the graveyard my friend had mentioned. It wasn't large, maybe a dozen or so headstones scattered across uneven ground. Most of the stones were old, their inscriptions faded or illegible, and some were tilted at odd angles, like they were sinking into the earth. I ignored the graveyard and focused on getting settled. The cabin had no electricity, but there was a wood stove for heat and a small stack of firewood beside it. I lit a lantern and unpacked my things, then sat on the porch to watch the last light fade from the sky. The woods were silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. Felt good to be alone. The first night was uneventful. I fell asleep quickly and woke up early, feeling refreshed. I spent the morning exploring the area around the cabin, sticking close to the clearing. The graveyard was even creepier in daylight. The stones cast long shadows across the grass, and the air felt colder there, like the sun couldn't quite reach it. I didn't linger. By the third day, I had settled into a routine. I spent the mornings walking through the woods, the afternoons reading or writing in a journal, and the evenings by the stove, listening to the crackle of the fire. It was exactly what I'd hoped for, until the nights started to feel different. The first strange thing happened on the fourth night. I woke up suddenly, though I wasn't sure why. The cabin was silent, and the only light came from the embers in the stove. I lay there, listening, but I didn't hear anything out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had woken me up. I eventually fell back asleep, but the uneasiness lingered. The next day, I found tracks in the dirt outside the cabin. They were faint, almost washed away by the wind, but they were there. At first, I thought they might belong to a deer or some other animal, but the shape wasn't quite right. They were long and narrow with a slight curve, like someone had walked barefoot through the clearing. I hadn't seen or heard anyone since I arrived, and the cabin was miles from the nearest town. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the uneasiness grew. That night, I woke up again, this time to a sound. It was faint, like a soft tapping or scratching, and it seemed to be coming from the walls of the cabin. I held my breath and listened, but it stopped after a few seconds. I told myself it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the wood, but I couldn't fall back asleep. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see something looking back at me. The next morning, I found more tracks. This time, they were closer to the cabin, circling it like someone had been walking around in the night. I checked the windows and the door, but everything was locked. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing inside the cabin was disturbed. I tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. On the sixth night, the noises came back, louder this time. The tapping was joined by a soft rustling, like something was moving just outside the cabin. I stayed in bed, clutching the flashlight I'd brought, but I didn't dare turn it on. The sounds went on for hours, stopping and starting at random. When the sun finally came up, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. That day, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, throwing them into my bag without bothering to organize them. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something on the ground. It was a small pile of stones, stacked neatly in a pyramid shape. They hadn't been there the night before. My stomach churned, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. Someone had been here. I hurried to my car, but when I tried to start it, the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked the gas gauge. It was nearly full, and popped the hood, but I couldn't see anything wrong. I wasn't a mechanic, but the car had been running fine when I arrived. I slammed the hood shut and looked around, hoping to see someone, anyone, who could help. The woods were empty. I spent the rest of the day trying to figure out what to do. There was no phone signal, and the nearest town was too far to walk before dark. I thought about following the dirt road, but the idea of being caught out in the woods at night terrified me. I decided to wait until morning and try the car again. That night was the worst. The noises started as soon as the sun went down, louder and more frantic than before. It wasn't just tapping and rustling anymore. It was banging, scratching, and what sounded like faint whispers. I stayed by the stove, clutching a knife I'd found in the kitchen, and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then the whispers grew louder, and I realized they were coming from the graveyard. I don't know how I found the courage to leave the cabin, but I did. I grabbed my bag and flashlight and ran toward the road, not caring about the darkness or the cold. I didn't look back, even when I heard something crashing through the woods behind me. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the dirt road. When I finally looked up, I saw headlights in the distance. A truck was coming down the road, and I waved my arms frantically, shouting for help. The driver stopped, and I climbed into the cab, gasping for breath. I didn't tell him what had happened. I wasn't sure he'd believe me, but I asked him to take me to the nearest town. I never went back to the cabin. My friend called me a few weeks later, saying his family had sold the property. He didn't ask why I left early, and I didn't offer an explanation. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about those tracks in the dirt and the whispers in the graveyard. Whatever was out there, I hope it stays far away.